Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back from lunch, and welcome to Pressure Points. This is, as Abidar mentioned, the second session called Stakes and Strategies. So just to review the theme of the conversation, how have individuals and local groups responded to gentrification? That's something that we will be discussing in depth during this session. We will introduce possible solutions as well as a range of creative actions and strategies that could be used to resist both the root causes of gentrification and its harmful effects. So we're thinking through some three sort of foundational questions. Why should people care about doing something about gentrification? What are some possible solutions that we can pursue? And what are some tactics and strategies that we can use as individuals as well as collectively? So my name is Bursey. I'm thrilled to be here and very excited to talk to our five esteemed guests around me, who I know will offer a lot of incredible insights to today's conversation. So I will introduce everyone quite quickly. And I'll start with Danielle Boissoneau. We're not actually in order, so if you could just kind of give a bit of a whoop-whoop. Great, thanks. Okay, so Danielle Boissoneau is Anishinaabe from the shorelines of the Great Lakes. She is a mother, a writer, a seakeeper, and a change maker. Danielle has recently returned from an Indigenous storyteller's writing residency at the Banff Centre for the Arts in Treaty 7 territory. C.A. Borstad Klassen, thank you, is from Hamilton. After studying music and planning, they returned to Hamilton, working at the Social Planning and Research Council for nearly 6 years. They coordinated the Neighbourhood Action Evaluation and consulted in program evaluation before starting their role as a community-based research coordinator at McMaster University. Stephanie Cox graduated from the University of Western Ontario with a degree in social justice and peace studies and political science. She's consistently been a grassroots community activist, both locally and internationally. After obtaining her BA, Stephanie proceeded to law school, where she focused her efforts on community access to justice, practicing in the areas of immigration and migrant justice, as well as housing and income advocacy at non-for-profit legal clinics. Stephanie is currently a staff lawyer at the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, funded through Legal Aid Ontario, providing representation to low-income individuals precariously housed, spearheading capacity building in the community, and combating systemic issues related to housing in the city of Hamilton, locally, provincially, and through community development initiatives and litigation in the Superior Court of Justice. Danica is an artist, educator, and writer from Cobourg. Her MA in Media Studies from Concordia questions social practice through interviews with artists and creative analysis of her fieldwork. She was a founding member of Publication Studio Guelph and helped develop the Benchik Youth Council, a radical arts education program in Rijeka, Croatia. Erika Morton works for the Social Planning and Research Council of Hamilton. She's the program coordinator with the Street Youth Planning Collaborative, or the SYPC, and the Youth Housing Support Project, the YHSP, which involves working with the community to prevent and end youth homelessness in Hamilton. And finally, myself, I'm an interdisciplinary artist, independent curator, writer and arts worker with an interest in social history and social justice, working class identity, and printed matter. Currently, I'm on leave from my position as program coordinator at the Workers' Arts and Heritage Center, a place that I really love. And I'm currently the interim manager of education at the Art Gallery of Hamilton. So to begin, just to root us in the conversation and to share a little bit about the work that you do on a daily basis, Could each of you please describe the work that you do that grounds you in today's conversation? And maybe we'll start with, to my right, with Stephanie.
Thank you. As was said in my introduction, I'm a housing lawyer at the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, and so my perspective is coming from seeing daily tenants in our city at risk of eviction or facing eviction. And then even if you're not already a tenant, seeing individuals have changes in their lives in terms of that really result in a lack of income, losing their housing, and then they become renters. So daily I'm interfacing with the folks of Hamilton who are literally being displaced through the legal processes of the Landlord and Tenant Board.
Thank you.
So I think the best way to describe my connection to this work is that I have had to survive continually since birth displacement in the context of colonialism. And what keeps me rooted in this work is the necessity of survival for my children and my children's children, and not only that, but the land and the water. And this is the way that I see the world, because I'm Anishinaabe. So my connection to the land and the water supersedes my current place in this world and goes back through my ancestral DNA since time immemorial. So the sort of displacement and violence that my people have experienced is kind of what's happening through gentrification to everybody else right now. So I'm working through a place of compassion and pity, because my people have been through this, and now that everyone else is experiencing it, I feel compassion and I feel pity. So I'm here to help as much as I can.
Hi everyone. So what brings me here today? So I work in the community. I support local organizations, including young people that have the experience of homelessness. And so just carry with me the frustrations that they're feeling around seeing young people being displaced in their community through gentrification, but I'd also say there's other systems that result in displacing young people to the streets as well. So seeing that from sort of supporting the community through some of those issues, and then also another part of my work with the Youth Housing Support Project. So it's a project that works directly with young people seeking support to find housing or to be prevented from experiencing homelessness and having to deal firsthand with some of the situations that no young person should have to experience in their young years, and feeling that coming from a very collaborative lens, that all the work that I do requires working with community partners. I think that the arts community and everyone in this room can be a part of that solution. So here today to kind of bring forward a youth perspective, and also just to remember that young people, they're our next generation, and we need to make sure that they're able to achieve their fullest capacity, and we need to start working today to make sure that all young people are able to reach the kind of goals and their fullest potential as much as possible.
The cables will extend better. My name is Danica, and I'm an artist and a writer, and I also have done some research. But I'm coming to this as someone who worked at an international socially engaged arts organization in Guelph. And kind of through that work, we often were involved with organizations that kind of often use the words social change. And kind of as I started to listen and be a part of these conversations, I became really critical about what that meant within cities in terms of beautification, gentrification, and those larger processes of funding and capitalism that we were talking about earlier. And so I think in that work, there was a lot of really great work, but also a lot of work around that maybe furthered some really problematic aspects of gentrification and injustice in the cities we worked in. And so then my master's research was kind of questioning that and critiquing that. And through interviews with practitioners, I developed a couple of tactics that I'm excited to share today. So when Sean mentioned this morning that artists should function as citizens. I really feel that, and that's the kind of perspective that I hope to bring to the work. So I'm excited to talk.
Yeah, good.
I would be happy to share with you, but just the camera. Sharing is caring. I'm CA. I think I'm here because of the work I did with the neighborhood action evaluation. I've done a few things. Anyway, so I'll talk about that, and then I'll talk about what I think comes before that. So the neighborhood action evaluation, Sarah Whitefield, who we heard from on the first panel, is the principal investigator on that, and I coordinated it, and so that was an evaluation of the neighborhood action strategy, which was a collaborative initiative from the City of Hamilton and the Hamilton Community Foundation. It is effectively not happening. I mean, it's sort of like, on pause, or like, who's it? Anyway, so like, nothing's happening. I'm just gonna say that. That's not happening right now. But I don't work for Sarah anymore, so I get to say that, and I don't have to worry as much, because now I work for my master. In a different role, doing similar stuff. So I think I'm a community-based researcher. I think I am. And I've come to that mostly just because I'm a human person who I was born and raised in Hamilton, and we grew up on what preceded Ontario Works, I just really care about my community, and I really care about all of the systems that make things very shitty for people, and I want to try to make them less shitty, and so I'm always trying to figure out, how do I do that? And I don't always know, but I think that's part of how I've come, like I sort of like, okay, research is one tool, so I think I've sort of taken that up as a tool. I question its efficacy daily. I do, but I'm in it still, so I don't know. I mean, I try to be useful. I think I should stop talking. We probably have other more important things to talk about. It's a harder question to answer than I thought it would be, I guess. Why are you here?
Okay, CA. Well, I'm gonna coax a little more out of you right now. I was actually really interested in the work that you do, and probably like a lot of people, I confused your work with the neighborhood action evaluation with the neighborhood action strategy. So just quickly, for the sake of the giving folks a broader context on that work, could you kind of share the role of each of those agencies and their relevance and how they interact with one another?
Yes, I can talk about what they are and how they're different and how they interact. I don't know that I can speak to their relevance. That's a grander question. But I can try. Okay, so the neighborhood action strategy essentially was the sort of major piece of major initiative that the city was like, code red, this is very bad, we need to do something. Anyway, oversimplifying, but anyway. And so partly the Community Foundation and the city were like, okay, we'll do the neighborhood action strategy because we have health inequities that are rooted in income and they're in neighborhoods. So we need to go to the neighborhoods where there's really bad health. We need to do things. Let's go to those neighborhoods and do some things. But we need to definitely not tell them what to do. We need to do community development. We need to have priorities set, do planning processes that engage residents there, and so they can tell us what they need, and then we're going to partner, we're going to try to figure out, so there are these action plans. There are 11 neighborhoods, most of them in the Lower City, one on the West Mountain. There have been community developers trying to do work for many years in various ways. Some of that planning and priority setting was part of it, working with the city and other service providers to try to do some of the things that were on the action plans. Programming. Not so much. I don't like. Do you want to?
No.
I don't. Well, I mean, the initiative was like sort of the planning, the local planning processes, and then trying to work towards those goals. So, I mean, if there's programming on the plan, then that would be. But some of the things on the plan would be like. Keith had an initiative about trying to get Keith neighborhood in North End. Where are we? Had an initiative about having fire alarms in all the houses, and so there was like a community-based thing partnered with I think the fire department. I'm not sure. Anyway, as a, this is one way that we can try to improve the health and keep our neighbors safe and build community at the same time and whatever. So, yeah. So that was the neighborhood action strategy. Is that clear, sort of?
Yes.
Okay. And the community developers themselves, like the sort of structure of it moved around. Initially, they were never City of Hamilton employees, and so at first they were at 5 different agencies because that was going to be good, and then that wasn't working so well, and then it was going to be all in one agency, and that was going to be good, and then that didn't work so well, so then it was going to be at the community foundation, and then that didn't work so anyway. So and now they're nowhere. I mean, they're not nowhere. There's human people still doing things, but those roles don't exist in that same way. So that's the NAS, Neighborhood Action Strategy. And then pretty early on in those conversations, some of the implementing partners were like, wow, we really need to make sure we research this, so that we evaluate it, so that we can show if it's working, so that we can continue to get investment from other orders of government to support this work. And so Sarah and others, Jim Dunn's work at McMaster on the Hamilton Neighborhood Studies, which is another kind of evaluation. Anyway, there are lots of different pieces of evaluation. Ours was primarily process evaluation, to be like, what is happening? What are people saying about it? So we did a lot of focus groups and interviews, qualitative data. And gentrification came up a lot in that, and people were worried about it, and that there was a concern. So maybe the relevance to this conversation I can speak to is that a lot of what we heard was concern about gentrification and things like the towers in the East End, people getting pushed out, or like we would go to meetings and be like, we're the researchers, we're the evaluation team, and residents would come up to us being like, I got this notice from my landlord saying my rent's going to go up by $200. Can they do that? And I'm like, that's not okay. Who you need to talk to is this and that and the other person. But anyway, so that was coming up, and then there was a concern, and like, can we say conclusively that this happened? No, but like, it is worth considering whether, I think, the neighborhood action strategy, by identifying certain neighborhoods and those being very publicized, became a kind of magnet for the higher income folks being like, I really want to go and be part of that neighborhood, and to know about it, and then being like, I'm going to get involved in my community association and do things, and I have all these professional skills, and I can contribute, and so it's not bad, but it's like then you're in a public consultation process that still has the same voices that are often there, and the priorities that get set into those plans are not representatives of the struggles very broadly within a neighborhood, and so that limits the effectiveness of that kind of strategy on the problem it was designed to address. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna stop talking, it's too long.
Okay, well, thanks for that context, and that actually brings me to a question I had in my mind around community benefits. Community benefits in kind of a more broad way, in some of the community benefits that a lot of us within an arts context are used to, like galleries, programs, and opportunities to engage in culture more broadly, but also community benefits such as parks and green space, local food systems, programming, and of course transit being a big one. So a question that I think a number of you will be able to speak to is there is certainly a tension between the creation of community benefits, like the ones that I named, and gentrification. How does this tension resonate with the work that you do? How have you worked, if at all, to mitigate any of those unintended negative impacts of community development work for communities vulnerable to the effects of gentrification? So how does that idea of community benefits basically, ideally being there to serve vulnerable populations or working class folks, then get sort of distorted through the process that you're kind of talking about, CA? Can each of us kind of speak a little bit to that?
Sure. It's tough, so I could talk for hours, so trying to make this succinct can be difficult. A lot of times when you look at even Metrolinx's website about like community benefit agreements that they have with the cities, they're talking to a niche privileged group, and so obviously those interests are going to be preferred, and a lot of value statements are resonating with the concept of we're going to hire local individuals, but they don't talk about the individuals who are being displaced from their home and how they're going to transition out, or if the community that's been selected for the LRT, whether that's an affluent community or if that's going to be in the space where there's maybe the only affordable homes in the community, and now you've eliminated that small amount of affordable homes. And so community agreements tend to look good on the surface, but they really have excluded a lot of the vulnerable individuals who are going to be subjected to the results of, for example, the LRT. The prospect of the LRT going into Riverdale was motivation for CLV to, reposition and find more desirable tenants, to be able to market that area as, a new place to come. It's revitalized. We have the LRT, and it's pushing out those community members because they find many ways to put pressures on the inherited tenants to move out and frustrate them. So definitely, this is a question of space, and this is a question of who's at the table having these discussions when community benefit agreements are being spoken to, and is there an understanding of the domino effect that a park or light rail transit will have on the people who are going to have the daily struggle. And so I think striking a balance of creating that space but not taking up someone's voice can be a difficult thing to do when you're an ally, and standing in solidarity with the communities that are affected by these projects. I've now gone on too much, so I'll let someone else speak.
So one of the reasons that I became an artist is, and I still struggle with identifying as an artist because I don't see myself as that. I see an artist as someone who's really got the space and time and comfort to be able to create things in a beautiful way without any sort of tension. I, on the other hand, have used words to be able to create a narrative that is in opposition to the narrative that colonialism and capitalism creates on a daily basis. That's the need for constant development. We need to be constantly creating things that are made from the land and the water, and we need to be constantly moving people, and we need to be constantly developing and moving all these things. And this is a trope that's existed for Black, Indigenous people of color since forever. So this is a thing that marginalized peoples faced all the time. So this is not something new. This is something that people have experienced forever. I think that this tension that folks are feeling right now is very close to home, and so because folks like artists are starting to feel this tension, and folks that have never had to feel this tension before are now starting to feel it, that these conversations are starting to happen in these sorts of spaces. And I think that that's a little bit unfortunate because what we're doing here is really talking amongst ourselves about something that's seemingly new when it's not. What we really need to be doing is talking with and including the people that have lived through these experiences since forever. I think unless we start to do that, we're really just wasting our time. We're really just kind of like revolving this wheel that's been going on over and over again. But what's happening now is that because folks who have not experienced this before are experiencing now, it's starting to become like higher level importance to people. In terms of allyship, I watched this really great video. This woman said, all right, if you want to be an ally, you're not Beyonce, you're not Kelly, you are Michelle. So So if you don't know who Destiny's Child is, please look into this, and then you'll see what's great about this. And this is the case. I mean, I really think that in order for us to be doing effective work, we need to be bringing the voices of the marginalized people to the very front. Not only because it presents a different narrative and puts these people who are living these experiences at the front, it's because what they have lived through and what they have experienced will inform our actions moving forward in an effective and impactful way. And unless we start to do that, we're just going to be spinning our wheels over and over again. And when I decided to come to this panel and I decided to speak today, I was really kind of struggling because of this dynamic, and I'm really working hard on not being cynical, and I'm really working hard on like being in the moment and being present, because that's my creative process. Because unless I'm not living in the moment and if I'm not being present, I get anxious and I get overwhelmed. And as we all know, this is not really beneficial to any sort of creative process. So for me, not only is it a matter of survivance, it's a method in which I'm able to be creatively resilient. And I do encourage folks, not to get overwhelmed by their guilt, because that doesn't help anything either. You know what I mean? Like, really just stay in the moment and stay focused, because what I'm seeing right now is a lot of people who are really interested in what the next steps are and how we're going to move forward. And I think that for me to look beyond what is in front of our faces, and I'll say it, is really like a lack of representation, right? There's really a lack of low-income folks in this space. There's a lack of marginalized peoples in this space. And what are we going to do to be more inclusive? I think that's a really important tension that hasn't been mentioned as well. And for us to be able to do so in a meaningful way, I think that's something that we all need to consider.
I feel like I might echo some of the comments, but kind of what goes through my mind in terms of community benefits is that I think in theory they can be great if we're looking at them from a lens of inclusivity and thinking about the needs of all people in our community. So if we're looking at, redeveloping parks, not including benches that would prohibit someone from laying down because they can't find a safe place to sleep, or God forbid they're using the free Wi-Fi at the rec center, gives them something to do with their day, and we don't know what they're doing on the Wi-Fi. So I think community benefits really, people want them. They just need to be created with more inclusivity. But I think what happens is, it becomes just another, how it kind of operates, it just becomes another tool for people to feel more and more marginalized. So again, speaking from sort of a lens of young people, they've already had lives, in their short lives, experienced a lot of being pushed out of systems, out of family, out of community, out of school, and now sort of the creation of these community benefits is just another way that they're being pushed out to the margins. And so I would agree that it's important to make sure that we're engaging with people, reaching out to different groups in the community and getting their input and their perspective and including their needs and their voices. And I think part of the question is like, what are you doing? I mean, one of the small things that I do is I work with a committee of young people with lived experience of homelessness. They're called the Street Youth Planning Collaborative Youth Leaders Committee. And I mean, as much as possible, I can pull them in and engage them on conversations, or they'll certainly tell me when there's things they want to talk about. But it's not adequate. I mean, it's not, it's one person and it's one committee that's able to give feedback on some things. So we really need to broaden our engagement with folks that have very marginalized voices, I think, in our community, so that we're all benefiting from the same great things about our community. So that's all I suggest.
Yeah, I fully agree with the panel. I think there's this question of what we are going to do to be more inclusive is really, really important. And I think that's the angle that I've come from an art perspective in terms of organizations. Zena, is your name Zena? Zena? Yeah? Sierra. Okay. Cedar. I'm so sorry. What you were mentioning this morning about kind of galleries doxing people or kind of like contributing to some of these forces that move people out, I think that's exactly the opposite of the kind of thing that galleries should be doing. I think there's a lot of talk around diversity and accessibility, but what that looks like tangibly is really tricky and often gets located in kind of like physical accessibility, which is so important, particularly in these old cities. There's a lot of staircases, but it's not the only form of accessibility. And there's some really good work going on in Toronto by Anne Zbitnu, who's part of Tangled. And she is doing some work around access and language and how that kind of like, a lot of art has this really kind of theoretical language put around it that is, or you go in and there's no information or no education around how people can engage with it. So I think that kind of like, I remember I come from a really small town, and like when I started to engage with art spaces, I didn't feel welcome, and I'm like a low-hanging fruit in terms of accessibility. So I think in my research, I interviewed Shan Turians, who's an Indigenous curator and scholar, and she really firmly stated that exhibition spaces are civic spaces and we need to hold them to the accountability of the fact that we are publicly funded in public spaces. And so I think that we need to ensure that art is the public service that it could be. So I think there are little ways to do that. Lakeshore Arts, Ashley Watson's really great. She lives in Hamilton, she works in Etobicoke, and they've just opened up their restroom and made it really, really publicly available to everyone who's in the community that they can come in no matter what and use their washroom. And that's like a super little thing, but it makes a huge difference in terms of people feeling like they have a space. X Space in Toronto has just started putting an open sign up. So do you have like signs saying like, we welcome refugees, Black Lives Matter, we're on stolen land? Like these kind of things send a message to people and make people feel accessible. Where do we advertise? Like, do we advertise at the library and laundromats, community newspapers, AM radio? Like these are little things, but they really matter, I think. So yeah, I think that's what I'll say. Oh, you're solo mic.
Like a Home Ranger. No, that's a tip. Home Ranger. Take that back. Yeah, I agree with many of the things that have been said here. The only other thing that I think I will add is that Hamilton has a Hamilton Community Benefits Agreement network. Folks who are trying to organize around this and trying to develop a policy and push the city to adopt a policy that would require any city investment or project over a certain financial threshold to develop legally binding agreements that would have various stipulations, and each project looks different, but there's like, we're not the first people to do that. There are lots of these other kinds of things, and so I think that is one of many tools, imperfect, absolutely, and would be very much strengthened by doing exactly what Danielle was talking about, to bring those voices to the front and learn from the folks who have been through all of these kinds of processes for so long, and not just learn from and like extract that knowledge, but like actually build solidarity, just make have relationships and actually relate and be in solidarity in a long-term way to advance the interests of folks who are often left out of those processes. And then just in terms of how to judge my work, one of the things that I do at McMaster is I supervise the research shop, where groups of students take on small research projects for community organizations through the semester. And so there's a group finishing up a report for the Hamilton Community Benefits Agreement Network, which is an environmental scan of some other community benefits agreement networks in other places, and to look at what some of the specific things are that are built into some of those as a kind of menu of options for that group to consider as they try to develop a binding policy with the city. So it's, it's slow, but people are working on it. Some people are working on it. Anyway, that's one way.
Thank you. So you mentioned the Hamilton Community Benefits Network. Danica, you mentioned some really important, small but very powerful gestures that art spaces can do to increase accessibility through language and through initiatives like signage, and that is really, really, really important. While we're on the topic of building out those kind of solutions, and also conversations around allyship, solidarity and getting people at the table, giving input, and specifically, movements that where working class folks, Indigenous folks, basically folks who are marginalized, at the forefront of them. Are there any other initiatives, either locally, that have not been represented either through the talk that happened that Kojo facilitated earlier? Is there anything else that we should know about, either locally or nationally or internationally? Some models that have created accessibility and opened doors to folks so that they have a position at the table in a very effective way. And what is that kind of recipe? What have they done right exactly, either locally or in a broader sense?
Not all at once now. So most, I wish I had the recipe. I don't. But some things that have been touched on that that I had prepared to talk about, which has already been talked about. But the Hamilton Tenant Solidarity Network is doing some amazing work. If you don't know what they're doing, read all their things. Think about if you can give them some time or some money or both. There are some very tangible examples of how rent strike is one thing, and there can be more organizing that can happen that can disrupt, that can really resist in a very tangible way the ridiculous nonsense. I think I wrote it down that Sean said. But this isn't to function the way it does requires our compliance with the ridiculous nonsense. And if we're not cool with it, then we need to demonstrate that we're not cool with it. So I think just want to put in another plug for that group. It's doing amazing work. Another group that I just want to name, I don't know exactly where they're at in their process, but there is a group, the Hamilton Community Land Trust, which is trying to do another strategy of, sort of intervening in land markets, basically to try to have community ownership to try to preserve or create some housing affordability. I think they're a pretty small group, but it's also worth checking out. And land trusts in general are a model that's been relatedly, I think, community development corporations are more common in the States because of various sort of political structures. But but there are some sort of organizational formats that can be used to try to keep, to have accountability, to have within the sort of capitalist system that we have, there are still some very small sort of legal types of entities and processes that can try to intervene to mitigate it. I don't know how effective they are. Really, if you would look at the whole big thing, there are ways to mitigate harm within the system that we have, and there are ways to, this is what Sarah was just saying at the break, there are ways to imagine and try to create actually quite other ways of living and being with each other, we probably need both, but it's important to try to distinguish which is which, and where we're putting our energy in any given day, I think. Anyway, I was rambling.
I think in terms of models and practices that are being used to be more inclusive, my perspective is really focused on how we're existing outside of these systems, because these systems are going to fall, and they're going to fall really hard. And so if you're still in this system when it falls, guess who else is falling? You. So the models and the practices that I want to point to are the models that are currently existing outside of the system. Particularly one of the most influential and impactful ones that I've heard is the Unistoten camp in northern British Columbia. And just by show of hands, who's heard of this camp? Lots of people? So it's not actually a camp, it's the home of the people that live there. If you haven't heard about it, please do Google it. And there's also another place up by Elliott Lake called Nimki Ashkabong. This is another camp. And I use camp very loosely because I understand that camp can be understood as a place that are people just using this land for a period of time. It's actually these people are reclaiming this land. These people are going onto the land and they're like, I don't have to ask Canada to live here. I don't have to ask anyone to live here because this is my land and I'm going to live here anyway. So this is what's really going on in these spaces, is a real strong sense of reclamation. And this comes from a decolonized sense of how we're existing with the land. And I think that this is something that's very different that we need to understand, is that a lot of the time we're understanding ourselves as the land being a commodity. The land is something that we can sell or we can own or we can buy. But when we're looking at it from a view outside of the system, we're understanding that we are actually subservient to the land, we are subservient to the climate. We are subservient to these things that we think are just extra outside things that don't really bother us, because I need to go to my 9-to-5 job and make money so I can get groceries, right? And I think that when we're talking about this, and particularly my own experience, because I'm an urban Anishinaabe, so that means like I'm an Indigenous person living in the city. So I have come to understand and to accept my role as being contradictory. Because as much as I can be like, yeah, you know, like the system sucks, it's gonna fall, I'm still gonna go back to work on Monday. Do you know what I mean? So how I, as an artist, am looking at models that exist outside of the system is one way that I'm helping to create a more resilient future for my children, and that's really my focus, and that's really how I am using my art and my time and my skills to be able to create this new future. I think the models that we're using need to be more creative. You know what I mean? We can't keep recycling these models of inclusivity, because it goes beyond inclusion. It goes so beyond inclusion. It really needs to be about how we are taking leadership from people that are marginalized and that have this lived experience. You know, and when we start to do that work, I think that's when change is really actually going to start to happen. When we become less human-centric, right? When we stop complaining about winter, because winter is actually Mother Earth resting. And if we could take ourselves out of that mindset where we come first because we're human beings, to maybe being like, oh, it's beautiful that Mother Earth is taking some time to rest because of all of the shit that we are putting Mother Earth through. Do you know what I mean? So these are the sorts of things that we really need to be looking at when we're talking about inclusion and diversity and allyship and solidarity, is because we need to put ourselves at the back, right? And even myself as Anishinaabe Kwe, when I'm consistently, you know, marginalized or having to speak up a lot because otherwise my voice wouldn't be heard, I'm still of the mindset that it's very important for me to put myself at the back, and this is something otherwise known as humility, right? And I think that we can all have a little bit of dose of humility moving forward, because at the end of the day, I think someone mentioned it might have been Sarah, talking about climate change. It is not something that's going to happen. We are experiencing climate change as we speak. And just because here in Hamilton we're not experiencing devastating floods and torrential hurricanes doesn't mean that it's not happening in the rest of the world, right? So in terms of models of inclusivity and diversity, the only thing that I really want to have you take away from my part of the conversation is how am I, as a human being in this time and space, making space for voices that are not heard.
So, I'm not gonna lie, I was thinking as we were talking about what I'm gonna talk about. But I actually started thinking about an experience. So, models of inclusivity. I feel like in my world, I hear a lot of talk about how do we do that, and not a lot actually happening. And I should probably apologize. I feel like my framework for this conversation is coming at like the continuum of like gentrification and displacement. Like my work is centered on, you know, homelessness and people that have been like devastatedly impacted by displacement. So I feel like I have a bit of a different sort of framework for how I'm talking. Anyway, so I was at this thing last year, I don't even know what it was, where I was, Calgary, something. Anyway, it doesn't matter. As a part of this committee work that I do. And while I do love this committee nearly and dearly, it's a national coalition of youth homelessness service providers. And we have these working groups. And one is on youth voice and engaging youth that have lived experience as a part of the work that we do. And it's been a conversation we've been having since I joined this committee, which was like 5 years ago. We just seem to spin and spin and spin on it. And so in the last meeting that we had, I came to this part of the meeting thinking, okay, we're going to be moving ahead. We've got this commitment, we've got this goal. But then there was this like really shitty conversation that happened in this meeting about like why are we doing this? Why do we need this? And seeming very sort of resistant and really resistant to this concept of having like a national advisor on youth voice, and spitting out kind of like, well, they won't keep coming back for meetings, or we have to make sure we're very clear on our intentions with them, and just spitting out all these excuses. And I just found it super frustrating because I don't think people seem to understand the importance of sharing sort of the power that we have and giving that up with the young people that really have way more expertise around sort of what issues and solutions we need to be focusing on. So it really struck me in the moment that like, why is this even a question? And like, why are we fighting this? And so, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think that just people spinning on it is just, and it's not just there that I hear people being like, yeah, we're thinking about engaging, lived experience. I think people really have this hard time of letting go their own power and privilege in their position, and make assumptions, that people with lived experience aren't going to be interested, aren't going to want to contribute ideas. But again, going back to some of the experience that I have is like some of the best ideas and conversations I have, and most honest conversations that I have are with the youth that I work with. So, long story short, thankfully we're moving ahead with said youth voice, and I'm definitely on that working group committee. I basically signed myself up for that for life, which is totally fine. But I think that people really need to reflect on how are they using their power and privilege in a smart way. To make sure they're creating and making space in a meaningful way for people with lived experience. Outside of that, I don't have any other groups that I might mention though. More again on the homelessness side of things, there is a great resource called the Homeless Hub. I don't know if people have heard of it. It's a website. They provide lots of free research around the whole sort of continuum around homelessness. So prevention, housing. They do sort of like analysis around policy and funding, and so it's not just research reports. They look at models that are working in communities, and it's across Canada, and they have sort of focuses on different groups of individuals experiencing homelessness. So they certainly have lots on youth, but Indigenous folks as well, women, you name it, all sorts of groups. So if you're interested to know a little bit more about creative solutions and ideas, I would suggest you check out homelesshub.ca for lots, and sign up for the newsletter. I feel like I'm their like media spokesperson right now, but it's very great tangible information. Like no offense, it's not like academic research. It's very usable, translatable, not harping on academic research at all. So yeah.
Yeah, so I have definitely experienced this in meetings as well, this kind of like people like suggesting that other people should be around the table and just being instantly shut down by people being like, oh, we couldn't possibly, like it'll be a different conversation and we can't have it. And I think, yeah, I've heard this from other people too, there is a real hesitance from people in power to give it up. But I think it behooves us to try different models. Danielle was mentioning this idea of supporting and putting yourself at the back, and I think that's been a real important part for me too. I think a lot of the conversations in art circles that I keep hearing is kind of like, how can I contribute my art practice to this work of anti-gentrification or social justice? And I think there are ways to do that. We can maybe talk a little bit about that later, but what I've kind of come to as an artist and arts worker is that I can be a participant in activism, and that doesn't mean necessarily contributing my art practice. Like, I think when Sean was talking about the citizenship of artists, I think that's so important that we are present in the streets, and present in MPs' offices, and present in supporting those movements of the voices that need to be heard, instead of being the center of attention as creators, which almost always, even if you're in a community-based practice, you are the author and you're at the center of that attention. So I think that's kind of, I think you can have your art practice and it can be your art practice and be great, and it doesn't always have to necessarily relate to your social change practice, which can be supporting the work, people who are doing the really good work. So in terms of thinking about other strategies, national strategies, The Public is a group in Toronto. They have a really great primer that I'm going to suggest that is Art, Design and Gentrification, a primer. And in that they talk about different strategies nationally, internationally, and they talk about the Oakland Creative Neighborhood Coalition, which seems to be doing really, really great work. Boissoneau is leading a group of Black women who are doing kind of artist-led spaces in Oakland, and they have had real success in negotiating a community benefits agreement with developers and then advocating for the city's planning department. So I think artists can be present, but artists can also support through, some of us have resources, some of us don't, it depends on where we're at, but sometimes we have access and people will pay attention to us in different ways. And I think it's important for us to use the fact that Hamilton is valuing us currently to kind of leverage that and be present in those spaces where other people might not be listened to. So, that you.
Okay, thanks, Danica. In my conversations leading up to this panel with Abidar Kamgari, we talked a lot about the kind of idea that a lot of artists sometimes get stuck on, which is, the way that I'm going to contribute to a cause, whether it's anti-gentrification work or anything really, is I'm going to make work as an artist that supports those ideas. But what you're suggesting and what a few of the ideas around this panel are suggesting is kind of thinking, shifting our thinking away from being artists within that context and being citizens within that context, which is a really useful framework. So a question that I have is, if anyone wants to kind of expand on that idea, and how can we think about creative acts, not artistic acts, but how creative acts can be generative and foster anti-gentrification work in the community. So shifting away from the work of artists and works of art and more towards creative strategies and creative acts of creativity.
So like I said earlier, I've had a really difficult time with identifying as an artist. And when I was at Banff Center for the Arts, one of my mentors was Ryan McMahon, and he's a podcaster and a comedian and a really brilliant human being. And something that he's shared with us that has stuck in my mind ever since has been process over product. And I'm not an artist, I'm really not an artist. I'm a writer. I could definitely say that I'm a writer with being comfortable with that being part of my identity. And the process of being creative often involves community building, it involves relationship building, it involves eating food together, it involves laughter. And this is really what we need to be doing right now, because as much as we can be offering solidarity to each other, if we only see each other at events and like protests and things like that, I don't have a relationship with you, I know you from the street. And that's completely different than someone that I would want to be going into a situation with where danger or violence might happen. So these are two very different things, and I think the process of being creative is one in which we're reclaiming our time and our energy. And this is very important as well, because if we're constantly living in a place of resistance, we're often left depleted and we're left angry. And this is not beneficial to any sort of creativity at all. And I find that for myself, because I'm a mother of 5 children, I work full time, I'm a writer, blah, 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 I do a lot of stuff. I think at the end of the day, what's most important to me is that I'm using my energy and my gifts and my skills to create a better world. And I think that at the end of the day, that's what a lot of artists are doing their work for, is because they want to use their gifts and their skills to make the world a more beautiful place. And I think that this is honorable, and I think that this is something that we all need to focus more on. Because unfortunately, capitalism has made art a product. Art is something that you buy. Art is something that you consume. right? So as people who are working in creative processes to create substantial change, we really need to be shifting the focus away from the product and more on the process.
I really liked your emphasis on relationship. Just speaking to, at least at the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, you know, it's daunting to require people to come through our door. We're an institution. We're part of other institutions that are part of the structural violence, you know. So relationship building is so important, and what that means is going to those invited spaces, meeting people where they are. We've, at least in our agency, have made sure that we go door knocking to Riverdale. We have community barbecues. People, I hope, see me as Stephanie and not just the lawyer. It takes time to do potlucks, to build that rapport, to build that trust. Our office has made sure that there's a lawyer or a social worker or community development worker at the shelters, at McMaster Family Practice, at other agencies. So all these trusted intermediaries are places where people are going daily and being invited into that space and then going to that space, as opposed to requiring people to come to the very institution that is exasperating their inability to meet their basic needs is a really big ask. And so going to that space, going to that community, having that rapport building, having that relationship building, it takes time. And it takes patience and it takes effort, but I mean, the work that I've done with some tenants has only been possible because of volunteers and HTSN taking the time to go and speak with folk, have a tea, have a coffee, get to know them as a person and not just as a number or a victim.
I feel like I don't know that I'm answering the question, but I'm just gonna say something. So I actually think that the beauty of the arts community and creativity and all that good jazz, I'm not an arts person, so I don't know if I'm using the right language, but art stuff is actually a really youth-friendly mechanism for engaging with young people, particularly, you know, youth that are marginalized, which might include youth experiencing homelessness. And so I think, and there's some good examples of art stuff. Looking over at Nia Reid and Kona, maybe he's gone now. But of youth-specific designed opportunities, organizations, initiatives for them to engage in the arts and whatever that looks like. You know, maybe with the frame of social justice, but maybe not. Maybe just as, you know, an escape for some young people, for them to have a healthy coping mechanism, for them to maybe build some skills, build their capacity around creating the arts. And a really important function of that too is helping them to feel more connected to their community, to feel that they're, just more connected to their community. And so I think that, you know, one great opportunity, full disclosure, I think a few of us were panicking on this panel thinking, oh my god, we don't have the solutions to gentrification, holy shit. But you know,
strategies.
Thank you. Before, like during lunch, we're all like, how are you feeling about the panel?
Strategies.
So one strategy I think is definitely engaging young people in sort of non-traditional ways, which can include the arts, around issues like gentrification and displacement. This zine is like super rad. Is one really awesome way I think that you can engage youth in the conversation and bring to light some of the issues to the public. And so I would encourage you to ask around about, you know, youth groups that you may be able to connect with, and talk to maybe organizations that might have project ideas or partnership ideas. Because there are youth that are definitely hungry and looking for opportunities to be engaged in sort of a artistic and creative manner as well. And it might not come come easy. Sometimes it takes a while. I'm talking a little bit of relationship building to build rapport with young people, especially youth that maybe, adults have been kind of shitty to them throughout their lives. But that's why you reach out to the community and ask for, how can we work together? What ideas do you have? What assets or resources can I offer that we can bring together and start to build relationships within sort of the youth serving community. So, sorry, I should mention Recreate too is another great youth collaborative. I'm sorry if I'm missing other youth stuff too. There's lots in Hamilton. That's another great opportunity. There's no lack of youth organizations, youth groups in Hamilton that can be reached out to and engaged and pulled into this work. And if you want any ideas, let me know. I'm more than happy to chat, or maybe Mia can chat, or yeah. I don't know that answered that question at all.
That's fine.
I was very selfish.
It's very selfish. Yeah. I guess I'll add to it just by saying that I think all of this really depends on where you're coming from. And I think Irene was talking this morning about just needing to be kind and compassionate and support each other as creators. I think that's so true. And I think for many people, the youth that you're talking about working with, your gifts are what you bring and what give you life and what you bring to the world, and it's so important to use that as a generative force for yourself and within your community. I think where I'm coming from is speaking with a lot of kind of arts organizations who are kind of trying to make that and utilize that as a tool for kind of urban development, and I think that's when it gets really sticky. So I think I think what each of us brings to the table is really important. So in terms of finding creative solutions, I think from talking with the artists that I've talked with, a lot of them talked about leveraging. And so what that looks like is kind of taking stock of ourselves. So what access do we have? What resources do we have? What are we good at? What can we bring? What spaces can we offer? What knowledges do we bring to the table? Then taking stock of the context that we're in. So who is listening to us? Who's our community? Who are we benefiting? Whose side are we on? And who might I be withholding access to or giving access to, and what are my revenue sources? Who am I responsible to? And then once you've got stock of that, of yourself or your organization, and then your context, then you can really act with intention within that. So, but it really starts from yourself and taking that stock of where you're at before you can do that. So, and I think depending on where you are on that scale, it can be leveraging. So I spoke with Cristobal Martinez, who's part of Post Commodity, which is an art collective, and he talked about kind of leveraging for kin. So Post Commodity is an Indigenous art collective, and they are often quite popular with socially engaged arts organizations. They said there's a lot of nodding when we talk. So for them, it's about leveraging the attention that they've got there to get resources for other Indigenous organizations and people of color in their community. And then Orif Katz, I spoke with, they did an MFA in New York, and they were talking about that being a privileged position. So for them, it was about getting the space they had and then ceding that power to other organizations at the school that didn't have it. So I think we can work really intentionally, depending on where we are in that spectrum, to either leverage for kin or leverage for our community, or seed the spaces and organizations and resources that we have.
You don't have to.
I feel like a lot of smart things have been said on this.
Okay. So I think we are running out of time.
You can go a little over.
A little bit over. I would like to, maybe it would be a good time though to open it up to the floor. If anyone has any questions, comments, remarks, for anyone on the panel or just in general with the 10 or so minutes that we have. Yeah.
A comment and then a question. I have a small arts organization in Toronto called Arts Pond. We have a collective impact effort that's looking to address many of these questions of what is the scope of the problem, how do we better engage, better educate our community to feel more empowered about leading social change initiatives like this. And the big issue that I'm most concerned about is about lack of evidence and data and solutions to help us move forward. So what is the scope of the problem to help advocate and bring in more partners outside of the arts? What are the barriers to involve arts leaders and unempowered future arts leaders to being engaged in this conversation? We're going to be publishing by the end of the summer a literature review of over 1,500 sources looking at solutions around the world, but also what is the scope of the problem globally and how can we potentially learn from other communities. So stay tuned for that. We're also going to be doing 2 province-wide surveys of arts industry workers and the general public, launched in partnership with a couple Hamilton organizations, including Hill Strategies Research and Cobalt Connects, at the end of May. So I'd love to have all of you participate and share your stories. The question I had for the panel is, in terms of evidence and research, what are the barriers you're experiencing or need to better understand how to work with the arts community and have the arts community be more engaged and have more citizenship in this issue? What kind of research or evidence or questions do you need answered to better engage with us or to have arts become a better leader in this kind of conversation? What would you want the survey or our research to look like?
In the context of data and evidence, for me specifically as Nishabe Kwe, I consider that question and those sorts of questions to be almost, depending on what you're looking, the evidence and data, what you're looking for, I think that, believing lived experience and working with folks that when they tell you their stories that you're believing them. I think that this is one of the best ways that you can do that. And just a caution of how you're approaching the question as well, because to a lot of folks who have this lived experience and are unable to come up with data or evidence, it can almost be seen as like a little bit of a form of gaslighting, because you're like, I don't know if I believe you because you don't have data or evidence. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not saying that you're doing that intentionally.
Positioned as evidence, the project is called Ground Story, and so I'm actually interested in the stories, and from the stories, evidence or whatever can be
And I think that's the great thing about art, right? Is that our stories are, there's an Ojibwe writer named Thomas King, and he says all that we are is our stories. Right, so I think that really looking at it from a perspective of like, how are your stories sharing your experiences might be a more useful way of engaging folks who have these sort of stories to share, because I think otherwise folks would just shut down and just be like, oh, well, I don't have data, I don't have evidence, so I might feel like my story isn't valid. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah, but thank you so much for that.
I don't have like specific questions that I would just the way that, but I do think about research a lot, and to me, part of what can happen in a day like this, and that could be useful more broadly too, is to try to, whether it's through story or other ways, make clear, make visible the ways that art and artists are. Can be positioned within processes of gentrification and displacement as a way of, what am I trying to say? Just that I think that sometimes we get into like, whose fault is it? And that's not very useful. It's capitalism's fault, so like, okay, what do I do with that, So yeah, we need to think about the things to do, and we can think about, but like the it's all, I think the implication of like whose fault is it or who can they blame, or like artists, they're being used. I think they're being used by capitalism. Yes, I think that's a great point that Cedar made earlier. But like, even if you could point a finger and be right, like that doesn't really, that doesn't tell you very much about who can do something about it. Because actually we can all do something about it.
It's very passive, it's passing the buck.
Yeah, but it's a deflection, I think, to be like, whoa. It's a deflection, and so that we can all just like take up responsibility for acting, actually, regardless of where, not regardless, but like understanding how we're positioned. I think just like I'm just talking about like basically a theoretical thing of all the things you said, of just like we need to understand what our resources are, what our leverage points are, so that we can have an analysis to design what our most effective things are that we can do in relationship with other folks. I was gonna say something else and it's gone now. But just like the blame. Oh, the other thing about blame and like self-blame, guilt, is it's just like so fucking draining, and it doesn't. It's not generative. It hurts and it stalls us out and it makes us inherently less effective. So I agree with things that people have already said about building relationships, finding joy, building beauty. Like these are ways that we energize for the work. Which is not a research question at all. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I just want to add to that because like this idea of guilt is like applicable to so many things too. Like it's often like an apology that like white people do, and they're like, we're sorry, we can't do anything about it. But like, or like an acknowledgement of privilege becomes just like well, I know I'm privileged, so, but like you're privileged, so like that means what privilege means is that you have access to resources, that people listen to you differently. So do something with it, Yeah.
Any other questions or comments from the floor? Okay, Cedar.
Yeah, I really like those last couple of comments because I was just thinking like, the way we frame a problem kind of leads us towards what solutions we think are possible, right? Yes. And to me, like, the problem is that we don't have control over like our basic living conditions, right? And that happens like, so if we understand things that way, then I would say like a lot of bureaucratic solutions don't necessarily get us any closer to having autonomy, right? And then we're looking at being, well, it's capitalism, so the land is a commodity and you can trade it. And that's like almost too big to understand. But yeah, I think it's a question of like finding our own reasons for this. Like I feel like I've heard a couple of different stories. I really like this idea about how do we get outside of these systems, because inside of it there isn't really like a great solution, But I feel like probably nobody in this room is more than 3 bad months away from like getting displaced too, And I feel like we've all got skin in the game, and they're just like the inclusivity question is like super important, but I think part of the problem is like that there are spaces that have power over others, and that maybe rather than asking how do we make those spaces more inclusive, maybe it's how do we abolish that power and make it so that people actually can have control in their neighborhoods. And I guess this is getting to the question part, but just that like artists have like a kind of a unique skill set in that, because the kind of what art is about communicating like feelings and ideas in like an evocative way, and it gets around some of our like ideological defenses we might have built up, right? And yeah, so I think just like what are ways to like unchain that in like surprising ways, just like to take it outside of like gallery spaces, to take it outside of like the art schools, to take it outside of the places where it's like expected and consumed, and kind of where it like blurs the line between like art and like attack or something like that, and just being beautiful but also uncontrollable. But yeah, I'd love to hear if anybody else has anything they want to say, but just the way that problem like impacts you personally, and just like how your understandings of this advise your solutions, because I can imagine everybody here has their own reasons for choosing to do this with their lives instead of something different,
Hi guys. for me, it's been a process of becoming more vulnerable. So I've spent my entire life building walls to protect myself. And for me, being vulnerable meant sharing my most heartfelt words that talked about what I've felt and what I've experienced as an Anishinaabe Koy on stolen land. What it means to be going to have a percentage of being 12 times more likely to be missing or to go murdered, and like what these experiences are very, very close to me. And poetry, I've written poetry since I was like 13 years old, but I've never shared it. I've shared a lot of political essays. I've written a lot of these sorts of things about how I think people could overcome these systems. And I think that I was really impacted by what you said about how art can find ways around ideological differences. And I think that's what being vulnerable does, right? And I think that a lot of times that folks are just so used to being hurt and to facing violence on a daily basis that no one wants to be vulnerable. And when it's actually our vulnerability, I think that creates these connections with each other. You know, when we're ready to say that, you know, I've been hurt and you've been hurt, and how have we all been hurt by these systems? And then what are we going to do because we love each other and ourselves so much that we're going to overturn these systems and we're going to create new ones, or we're going to decolonize ourselves and create new pathways. You know, and I think I probably would not have said that 4 or 5 weeks ago, because at that time I still had my walls up, and I still do in certain senses. But I do realize that being vulnerable is one way to build authentic relationships, and then to be able to create new pathways to how we're going to work together.
I mean, so I just want to make sure that I'm understanding your question so that I can try and answer it. But just like about how we're positioned, like what brings us here, but...
Yeah, what's your stake in it?
What's my stake in it? I mean, I think, I don't know, yeah, that's what I answer. I feel like I have walked in two worlds on a lot of different axes in the world, where like I have this middle class job and this middle class life, but I feel like in my mind, like I'm just a poor kid. Not just, but like that's my reality, even though that's not my reality here. You know, I was socialized as a woman and lived as a woman for most of my life, and then as I unleash my trans magic, you know, I feel more myself than ever before, and I also feel like deeply scared all the time in a way I never did as a woman. And like, not that I wasn't scared as a woman, but I'm like, ugh, it's very different. It's very different in my body now. And I also like have used the class privilege that I've had to access education. And so like I have a master's degree that I use to try to do research in ways that I think are going to advance a project of social justice. And like, it's imperfect. Always imperfect, and I just feel like I'm in between. I'm like, you know, in so many ways, in terms of gender, in terms of class, right? Like my job right now is at a university that's like university community, and like I know a lot more about community than I know about the university, but I get heard in the university in a way that I'm like, you don't even know me. Why would you listen to what I say? But it's like, oh, well, I don't know, there's some kind of like those weird, sort of the way that I get seen out in the world. Anyway, so I feel a tremendous responsibility is what I'm coming to. I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility to use the privilege that I have to try to make the world any more just at all in any way that is accessible to me. And I think particularly like, I think about it particularly in terms of my whiteness, trying to use the privilege and complicity and sort of power that gets given to me without my merit at all to dismantle racism, to understand racism, to actually fight, and in terms of gender, that like trans folks, you know, like the rates of violence are tremendous. And I have been protected from a lot of that for most of my life. and now I'm slightly less protected, but I also have masculine privilege now in all kinds of queer spaces, and like that's a super weird thing. Like, so I'm just anyway. I feel like I straddle like madness and sanity, and I genuinely I feel like I walk in both worlds, and I feel like I've often said to myself, like, I think I'm too crazy to work. I'm like, but I have to work, and so I just try to cope in whatever ways that I can. And I feel very grateful for the ways that I'm supported in coping to be able to keep doing that. But like, it's a mess. Does that answer your question? Thank you for calling me up to be more vulnerable. I was like, I don't know how to answer this question, and then I just like cried. So. Thank you.
I kind of want to end it there. Abidar, what do you say?
I mean, that's right on the
Thanks, everyone. Chat with all the panelists. We have a whole afternoon ahead.